It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all here this evening for the fifth of our online series of reconstruction events, this one in partnership with CODE, the Centre of Dynamics of Ethnicity, with whom we have further events planned later this year. These are public conversations with an intergenerational and interdisciplinary flavour, which have to date included writers, historians, journalists, students, politicians, and activists. The foundation is a small but confident charity with big hopes and a zesty website. Inspired by the life and work of Stuart Hall, it remains committed to matters close to his heart: public education, power and inequality, race and identity, representation, and visual culture. Stuart was also committed to complexity, not only the asking of difficult questions for which he is often quoted, but the need to wrestle with the difficult answers that present themselves. Our reconstruction series is offered in that spirit, hoping to generate further inquiry and help us in the task of imagining a more just and equal society for all. This last year has seen a rapid rise in the recognition that the life of the mind matters. Mental health is suddenly everywhere. Few would now dispute our primary need for human contact and the devastating impact of loneliness, deprivation, and loss. There has been much to make all of us feel mad with rage, fear, and helplessness, not least being locked in with the daily diet of news confirming that greed is wrecking the planet, injustice is rife, and the effects of being locked out by poverty, being a woman, or having brown skin potentially catastrophic. NHS services have seen a troubling rise in depression, self-harm, and the relentlessly controlling habit of eating disorders amongst children, a response perhaps in part to a grown-up world that feels increasingly careless and dangerously out of control. You'd search in vain for a Hall paper on something called mental health, and yet Stuart's preoccupation with the conjuncture, what we might call the conditions in which we become a person, and his concern with questions of belonging, experience, identity and identification, are lines of inquiry that are central to the matter of psychological integrity, which depends so much on the fundamental need in all of us to have a proper home in somebody's mind. His preoccupation with his sister's breakdown during adolescence and his reflections on Fanon distill something of the psychic cost of imperial history and invite complex questions about how the world outside gets under our skin and how our inside life, the life of our mind, meets and is met by our most immediate and wider environments. We know that domestic violence between parents gets into the blood and bones of young children, by which I mean their core, not their DNA, through their eyes and ears and the pores of their skin. We know that parental states of mind, prolonged depression, undigested trauma, work into the layered fabric of a child's mind. There is now increasing clamour for indexes of inequality to be a serious part of the inquiry into psychological vulnerability and how to treat it. For some time now, there has been compelling evidence that Black British men are among those most likely to suffer the most severe mental illnesses. This troubling fact suggests a complex conspiracy between external structural equalities such as poverty and other key factors of vulnerability: early childhood experience, disrupted patterns of relationships, parental mental health, and intergenerational trauma. There comes a point when a mind has too much to bear. The lack of proper care and timely support for this vulnerable group is another disturbing fact and speaks to the wider dismantling of early intervention, the over-medicalization of mental health models, and a historical disregard for the kind of mental pain, grievance, and distress that the repeated injuries of racism can foster. Such arguments expose a national deficit of attention to the accumulative psychological harm that feeling pushed out of an equal chance at life can do. They insist that to disregard the invasive experience of being projected into, distorted and bloated by all the most hated and feared bits of the human condition is a national dereliction of care. In the course of my life as an NHS-employed child psychotherapist, a number of experiences could be brought together in the sketch of a primary school-age Black British boy, referred for or already burdened with the ubiquitous diagnosis of ADHD and ODD, which is oppositional defiance disorder, or saying no. A boy already excluded from one or more primary schools, diagnosed by a range of caring, thoughtful professionals as aggressive, lacking empathy, mindless, a cause of despair for his already struggling family, usually a closed off, lonely, homeless feeling sort of boy who has stuffed his vulnerability deep into the pockets of his already too low slung trousers and mastered a swagger to show in every possible way what a bad boy he already believes himself to be. Such a child is already on the edge of life, making a home from the homeless state in his mind, a state with roots in his family, their history, the eyes of his teachers and peers, and the wider world. This is a state of emergency for an 8-year-old boy. Such deep and disturbed states of mind will not simply be solved by a diagnosis or medication, a mentor or diversity training, more money, a revised curriculum, cold water swimming, or 6 sessions of online counselling, useful as all of these things might be. If we're really to talk about what has gone wrong, we have to want to know about the whole complex picture, which includes, but is not determined by being a little brown-skinned boy growing up in post-colonial Britain. We also have to be prepared to wrestle with the difficult answers that might present themselves. I'm very pleased to introduce our 2 discussants this evening, James Nazroo and Lanre Malaolu, to begin a conversation about inequalities and injustice in mental health. James Nazroo initially trained in medical sociology at St George's Hospital Medical School and is now, amongst many other things, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and founding and Deputy Director of the Centre of Dynamics of Ethnicity. He has an extensive history of research on issues of inequality and social justice in relation to ethnicity, age, and gender, and how these relate to health. He's currently investigating ethnic equalities in severe mental illness. Lanre Malaolu is an award-winning director, choreographer, and writer for film and theatre, who uses collaborations of text, movement psychology, and dance to mesmerizing and unforgettable effect. His award-winning film, The Circle, is one of a number of projects addressing the complexities of being a Black man in 21st century Britain. Some of you may have been lucky enough to see his stunning live performance of Elephant in the Room, and otherwise, I hope you've been able to access the link. As usual, our format for the evening is that Lanre and James will be in conversation for 35 minutes or so, followed by a Q&A, which we hope you will join via the Q&A box. James and Lanre.
Thanks, Becky.
Thank you very much, Becky. A great introduction and framing for the conversation that Lanre and I are about to have. Hello, Lanre.
Hey, man.
So I wonder if a good start for this conversation is to talk about the ways in which your work has focused on how we can and can't talk about our experiences of mental health, mental illness, and how that kind of ties in with your representations of masculinity and of Black identities, and ultimately connects with questions of stigma. I wonder why these things are so important to you, why they featured so prominently in your work.
We're just jumping in, just nice. I love it.
Yeah. Why not?
I mean, it's a big question for me, and it's something that I'm I don't sit down and ask myself that question. So it's really, it's something that I have to kind of take in. And I guess I take it in, and I start, and I remember that I start from myself, right? So all these things, masculinity, mental health, the things that I've hidden, or that I hide as a man, as a Black man, from puberty to now. And I guess there was something inside me that wanted to question, right? I wanted to question, I wanted to understand more. And I think that's at the core of all the work that I do and want to continue to do, is to continue to question, to nudge, to learn more about myself, about my community, and about people, and about relationships and the nuances within those things. I think mental health and masculinity, they're such big things, and and they're really big ideas, and actually sometimes it feels like we slap on one sticker for the thing, oh, masculinity, and we think we know what it is. Mental health, same as that. But one thing that I've been really, I don't want to say interested, I would say obsessed with, and exploring through the work that I do, is the nuances inside it. And so the nuances inside masculinity, Black masculinity, the nuances inside mental health, Black male mental health. So I kind of, yeah, to answer your question, it started with just understanding me and myself, and I'm still continuing to do that after being in this game for, like, I don't know, a decade now ish. Yeah. And I only feel like I've scratched the surface.
Yeah. I mean, the performances are really powerful, of course, but one of the things you just said about nuance kind of really strikes me as a researcher in the field. So I'm not sure I told you, but my first research job was studying mental health, and so I've been doing work on mental health for more than 30 years. But I wonder whether in this kind of research, or at least the kind of research I do, we miss some of that subtlety, some of that nuance, some of the variation in meaning, but also this, how people themselves talk about their health and their mental health and so on.
Yeah, and for me, I guess, and so interesting, just the different perspectives that we have, because for me, I'm sure in both situations, there are things that we get via your research methods and via, you know, my artistic methods that the other maybe doesn't necessarily get in certain elements of nuance. But for me, I guess, well, guess is not the word. For me, I feel that the physical body holds everything, holds the answers, right? We don't think emotions, our body feels them. You know, we now know it's scientifically proven and proven via research that trauma is stored in the body, physically, in the body, in the skin, in the DNA to a certain extent. And so I'm really, again, I use the word obsessed about how one taps into that in a way that can't maybe necessarily be done via research means, right? It's a different type of research. It seems, or it feels to me like it's an active, visceral type of research. Do you know what I mean? Of these things, and so yeah.
No, I kind of feel that we do try and measure in the work we do try and measure this embodiment of distress. So we have a whole set of ways of trying to do that, largely measuring hormones and stuff like that to get to that. But it doesn't have, I think you're right, it doesn't have that visceral feel to it. When I put up a chart showing metabolic syndrome or equivalent, nobody knows how that feels.
I don't know what you just said.
Yeah, exactly. It's a biological term. And, you know, but the distress that reflects, or the stress that reflects, and the way inequality is embodied in these ways, I don't think comes through. I mean, it is interesting because I think, as Becky introduced, social justice, inequality has been my motivating factor for the research I've done. And almost all of it focuses on questions of inequality. And mental health becomes a tool actually for illustrating those inequalities so powerfully and so profoundly. But to do that, you actually have to capture the distress that people are experiencing in one way or another, and their ways of coping and their ways of managing their lives, and so
on. For sure. And I think, I remember growing up in school, and I don't know the specific ones, but everyone has different ways of learning, right? There's people who learn via imagery, people who learn via listening. I don't know if you know the technical terms, I don't, but I know that there's different ways. And so it's interesting because the incredible work that you do has opened so many doors and continues to open so many doors of understanding. But there are some people who would come across that who just wouldn't know how to take that information in, right? And I'm actually one of those people. Although I can listen, I do understand, and I do have a sharp mind, a sharp brain in terms of understanding those types of. But I see pictures, I see images, I understand visuals, and feeling, and so there's something, really interesting about the avenue of having the physical body, having text, having the artistic form to express and explore those things. And also the conversations that are fostered, afterwards, right? Because that's the reason as well, right? It's not just to kind of go to tap into that distress and to put it on a screen and go, it's to initiate a conversation, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, not just with people outside said race, but also people, within our own communities. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's true, isn't it? There are whole ways in which we can engender conversation about these things, and perhaps the most powerful ways are through performance and creative arts, as well as through someone like me standing in front of an audience and putting up a graph, which may not be the best way to engender conversation.
But you said, I want to, because I remember we talked on this, and you said something about there's an element of performance that you do.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about that, because I
absolutely. Absolutely. It occurred to me when you were talking, actually, that so this is a previous conversation that we've had, that of course, when I stand up in front of an audience, I know I'm performing as well. That people, and if a presenter doesn't perform, then the audience loses interest pretty quickly, and so you do have to perform, and part of that performance is to try and get emotion into what you're saying. So when I talk about inequality, I do try and illustrate it in ways either through my voice or through the image that I put up or the representation of a person's life that I put up. I try to get some emotion going so that people can understand the extent of the issues that the data represents. So performance is I think, really important. I think a part of that, of course, is engaging with the audience in a way that that's what you do. Part of that is me trying to engage with an audience.
But something you said is really important, and I think, I sometimes, when you're making a piece of work or whatever, you sometimes, when you're in, if there's 3 acts of this piece and you're in act 2 or whatever, and you sometimes forget the one thing, the most important thing you said, and it's about eliciting emotion. That's it. There's no matter what, our aim through the stuff that we do, whether it's via my means or yours, is to elicit emotion in order to initiate change, right? And to initiate a conversation, a deeper understanding. But emotion is universal, right? It's everything. It's everyone has and knows emotion. So that's really, it's really beautiful to hear that, actually, from you. From your
yes, but to offer something a little bit potentially controversial in relation to how receptive audiences are to to that message. And so many of my audiences, of course, are fellow academics or policymakers or so on. And so the other elephant in the room for them, many of them are willing to actually talk about an abstracted notion of mental health, but the other elephant in the room for them is racism and their unwillingness to thoroughly engage with. So more now these days, following Black Lives Matter and other issues around COVID and so on, people are more willing to begin a conversation about racism, but not to get into a conversation about racism.
Sorry, I'm laughing because I know exactly. Yeah, we can begin it, but how in it are we going to be getting?
Yeah. And, so I think things have changed. I mean, there was a time when the word racism was never mentioned in the room, whereas now it is. But I do feel that there's still a kind of superficial skirting over the word and away from it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because yes, I agree with you, but it's almost it's crazy because there's this coin, right? You've got the front of the coin where it's like, oh, obviously from what's happened the last couple of years, there's more people talking about it, but it's now being forced. Like, it's like, before it was like, oh no, it's certain you don't want to talk about, or you know, it doesn't really expand into a bigger conversation because of that defensiveness or X, Y, and Z. But now there's this kind of energy of, okay, well, we have to now. And I feel like there's a cutting off of the actual understanding and listening and empathizing because of the pressure that actually needs to be put on in, you know, certain organizations and the world. But there's that other side to it as well, where actually, even when certain organizations or certain people, like you say, in your circle of people are talking about it, it's because, okay, well, we have to now. And I don't know what the answer to that is, and I guess that's just an observation rather than
I think there are some really profound challenges in actually confronting questions of racism for many of these organizations, or the representatives of these organizations, having to rethink fairly fundamentally what they do and how they do it. And, you know, coming back to the question of mental health, I think Becky introduced the kind of issue of the high rates of mental ill health, and particularly severe mental illness amongst young Black men. And the very high rates of ending up in secure settings. And one of the things that my research has focused on is that question, you know, how and why this is happening. And it really kind of has although I don't do criminal justice work, some of my colleagues do, of course, so it really has such strong parallels with the criminal justice system. And you think about the ways in which experiences of trauma generate these experiences of poor mental health, but then how that's reinforced through their treatment through mental health systems.
Oh yeah. Oh wow. No, that just hit me because I facilitated these workshops in HMP Thameside Prison about I don't know, 3.5 years ago, I think it was, and predominantly young Black male inmates, exploring well, I was brought in to explore movement with these men, right, and exploring touch and sensitivity. And you know, they didn't really know that. They just, you know, it was organized. I was brought in by this incredible organization called Arts Admin, and they showed some of the inmates some of the pictures of the first film that I made called Figure, which was exploring fatherhood from my perspective and a young black man's perspective. And so the reason why I say that is because I've never thought about that parallel, like you've just said, about you know, until when I put the pieces together of the puzzle of that experience that I had, which was pretty life-changing, to say the least. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Becky said during her talk, she said crisis point, the phrase crisis point. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, actually, how a lot of these young men are reaching crisis point before they are able to even get help, or it's straight from 0 to 100, right? And I don't know. I remember when I first went to the doctors to talk about my anxiety, right? And it felt like a battle to get support and get her to understand and believe me, right? I remember sitting down there, and it was hard, and it's I'm exploring this in a project, but it was hard to even just pick up the phone, right? And this is where I talk about the nuance of the Black male experience, because the reason of that stigma, right? Which I think stigma is now quite a loaded word, actually.
Yeah.
But the stigma around it as a young Black man created this invisible barrier, this invisible kind of tension of me picking up the phone. Like it took a long time before I could even pick up the phone and call the doctors, right? And I'm not the only one. There's many young Black men who are like that. Oh, just keep going, man. Hey, we saw this guy. Just come on, man. Yeah. Don't talk to it. You know, just keep going. Just keep going. Just keep going. So I did that, and I rang, and I remember, and again, Becky would have seen this because she saw the show, and there was there's a scene in this where it's slightly verbatim, more or less, of the experience that I had. But even to get the number to speak to someone was like, she didn't really want to give it to me. She was like, there's a long waiting list. I don't think you need it. I'm not sure you. And it's hard because you're there as a young man, you're very vulnerable, right? You've come in, opened yourself out, said these things, talked to this person for the first time, in some cases about your experience. And then you're hit with that, where it's like, oh, okay, so maybe I'm okay. No, you're not. But maybe I am. No, you're not, but maybe I am. And that, again, contributes, right, to the cycle, and contributes to going back to the words crisis point, where if that's happening, and again, I'm sure and I hope that that's changed, and it feels like it has, and that was, to be fair and to be honest, that was, God, about at least 5 years ago. And I'm sure things have changed, but still, there's barriers to entry, right? Barriers to even getting that help. And then you've got the barriers of finding the courage to even pick up the phone and do that, right? As a young Black boy who you know has had to live the way he's lived. So yeah, wow.
Yeah, no,
I don't know where I just went on a tangent there, but
no, not at all. I think it's a really complex set of processes that you're kind of highlighting here. You know, that there's part of that challenge of within your identity being able to say, actually, I'm in trouble and I need to get some help. But then there's also in the back of your head the wonder about how you're going to be received when you actually go and seek help. And then you have the encounter with the person who either dismisses you because they think that cannot be the case for you because of your identity, or they think, oh my God, here is a dangerous person walking in. I need to do something quick to stop them being a danger to other people or to themselves.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of mix of stigma, the stereotype of angry, dangerous Blackness, and so on, all coming into play. And I think, as you said, and I've tried to say, that there is also this, you know, that people like you are not being treated well within these systems. And so is it safe for you to go into this system?
And that's important to mention as well, because I talked about that barrier of picking up that phone to make that call, and that barrier is loaded with that, you know, this mistrust, right? And like you say, not feeling safe with quote unquote higher powers, you know. Yeah.
I mean, so one of the things that is changing, so I'm not sure that has changed, which is a pessimistic thing to say, but one of the more positive things that is changing, of course, is the increasing numbers of Black-led organizations providing support and care, and Black therapists and so on, moving in to fill what is probably a kind of space, a lack of provision from mainstream services. I don't know how, I guess I feel that this is very valuable. It does provide the provision of safer spaces. It does provide the provision of spaces where perhaps stigma is not going to be so felt, and also perhaps where the stigmatized Black mad person is not going to be so present.
Yeah, and I think, you know, speaking to someone who understands the unspoken, right? You know, especially for black people, men and or women that go in to seek help from Black therapists. There's that understanding, that unspoken understanding that doesn't need to be spoken about, which sometimes is the hardest thing to do. I imagine when it's, you know, with a white therapist. So yeah. Yeah, well,
I guess there is something difficult when you bring into the room something that the person you're encountering cannot really grasp, and maybe isn't ready to grasp either. Though maybe that's a harsh thing to say about a therapist, I don't know, but it may not be a harsh thing to say about a doctor or a mental health practitioner who would typically resort to pharmacological interventions, so to drugs and medicines rather than to talking therapies.
And there's an interesting conversation there to be had about how we change that, right? You know, how these medical people in power or therapists who are not Black, if there's a part of the training, or, you know, again, I am not in legislation or anything like that. I don't know how, you know, but I'm just saying, is there or could there be an element where these people are informed and have to learn, so that if they do encounter Black people, they're able to, of course, you will never truly know, but you know, empathize and understand at a deeper level than they would without that. And obviously those, whether they're, you know, classes or whatever they would be run by Black people, right? And so that these therapists or doctors have the just a bit more insight that feels a bit deeper, you know, a bit deeper.
Yeah, though I worry that there's a set of kind of real institutional constraints that prevent things like this happening. So I have in my head the picture of a young man being brought to casualty who's really upset about something, and he's brought to casualty, and what resources does the doctor have to deal with this person who's in crisis, for the whole set of reasons that we've been talking about, of course, that you've illustrated, and the resources that the person has is sectioning and pharmacological medicines, which then shut down the emotion of the person, of course, in a very convenient way, but then also has dramatic impact on the life of the person as well.
Yeah.
But maybe that's overly pessimistic. Maybe there are ways of changing that, but perhaps one of the ways of changing it, as you said, is about making sure that the voices of the people who are in this situation are present and heard in education systems, are present and heard in our communities, and present and heard in alternative therapeutic settings.
And I think something you mentioned as well, which actually we kind of glossed over, but there's so much importance in that, about, you know, you said there's more Black organizations coming out who are supporting mental health and who are making, you know, developing these initiatives. And I think it's going to come down to that as well, right? Because once there's enough initiatives and people, these initiatives are creating change and initiating change, hopefully that can just foster and build and build and build. And there's some incredible, even like podcasts, right? People who are running podcasts, like Dope Black Dads is one of them, where they don't necessarily talk directly about mental health, but they're talking about fatherhood and they're talking about blackness and all those things. And it's an incredible platform that they have. And there's so many different other platforms. And I think the more that happens, the more that, look, I think it's so interesting, isn't it? It's just that there's an element of just being seen, right? And I think we as human beings, we all want to be seen, right? And in other words, you could say we all want to connect with each other. I think at the very core, the one thing we all need, even if you think about COVID, right? Like it's the I remember, like, I don't know, the first lockdown, month in or something, everyone was running around inside their heads like headless chickens, right? Well, most people from what I know, because it's like this crazy thing that's happening. And then there was a time where I was like, oh shit, don't know if I'm allowed to swear, done it. What is, like, the idea of hugging someone?
Yeah, I
was like, raw. I was like a month or 2 months or something. I was like, I ain't hugged someone. And I felt, because a hug is not just it's being seen, right? It's such a beautiful physical. I mean, obviously, I would say that because I work with the physical body and touch and all those things and sensations. But I'm sure people will well, maybe will understand that, of that kind of. So I say that all to say that, like, these organizations and these podcasts and stuff are allowing people to be seen. And as a Black man, if you feel like you're being seen, then actually, in the right way and in the robust full circle 360 degrees way, then actually you're more inclined to speak, and you're more inclined to stand your ground, and not to stand your ground just with strength, but also with vulnerability, right?
No, I think that being seen is a really, really important issue, and the way you describe it as well, I think is really important. So being seen all around, as it were, being seen by being in contact, and being seen in a way where you can expose different dimensions of yourself, including your vulnerabilities. And that kind of leads me to thinking about where and when it's safe to be seen. And I think one of the things about your performances is that these are spaces where it is safe to be present, and it's safe, even though there are fundamental challenges in the stuff you do. The way you do it and the purpose behind it perhaps enables you to feel safe to be, for people to feel safe to be seen, and for their vulnerabilities to be seen, and that safety, I think, is really, really crucial.
For sure. And it's crazy because I don't know how. I think, I guess the way that I've figured out how to do that, how to foster that, is being vulnerable myself, right? Like, truly to the core of the word. And you said something that reminded me of going back to the workshops that I did in this prison. And these men were predominantly Black men, and at the beginning of the session, we do like a touch-in, right? And that we'd go around the circle, and we'd ask each of the young men, tell us one good thing and one bad thing that's happened to you this week, right? And it would sometimes be very hard to get good things, because they'd just be like, yeah, I'm stuck in here, and I'm stuck in here, I'm stuck in here. But we kept on with it, and this was like midway through. This is a 6-week course we were doing with them, and like midway through, this happened, where where we went to one of the guys, and I still remember his physical position. He was crouched in, and this guy held the status in the room. Like anytime I'd asked him to do like an exercise or anything like that and move, they just all kind of just, their eyes would just dart to him, and I sensed it and I got it. I was like, okay. And so he was very, very strong and held everything. And holding things is a really important, interesting, and integral thing that I've been trying to understand in myself and to dissect in the work. But this young man who, you know, held the status and, you know, was like, had this real kind of facade. He was just looking down, and he was just shaking his head. He was shaking his head. And then he looked up to the group, and he just said, "I'm tired of being strong. I'm tired of being strong. I'm tired of being strong. I'm tired of being strong." He kept on repeating that, and it sent shockwaves through my soul. It sent shockwaves through my soul and through the space. And I go back to the words, the things we hold, things that we feel as Black men we need to hold, right? And so the reason why I say that is I don't know when he would have been able to say that. Right. And I don't know, I'm not telling you, I'm not sitting here going, you know, I don't know what the answer, I don't know how I did that, other than how I am and how I am in a room and being vulnerable, and also being able to, you know, I'm a working class Black boy. I was born and bred in Hackney, pre the beards and the bikes and the calves. Do you know what I mean? I've seen some shit, and so I could relate to them. I mean, I still walked in there shitting myself. But yeah, and so I say all that to say that, yeah, it's not, and also it's not about me, right? It's not about me. It's about that moment. It's about that moment, and knowing that he has never said that in his life to anyone in that way, in a group of Black men in that way, yeah. Right? And I don't know, man. I'm riffing now, but I'm just it's yeah. That's why I do what I'm doing, in it. Do you know what I mean? Like it's because of that, because of those spaces, and it's not necessarily in just workshop forms, but it's also, like I say, the conversations that you have after you know, a film or after a theatre production or whatever it is. And sometimes that conversation isn't with people. Sometimes that conversation is the one with yourself, you know. Yeah.
But there is something important there, isn't there, about well, obviously there is. Sorry, I'm talking. I was going to swear then, talking rubbish.
Do it, James. I've done it twice. Do it.
But I was going to say talking shit, of course, but I'm talking shit. But there is something really important there about the ways in which people can free themselves from fairly narrow definitions of what it is to be a man or to be a Black man, and to be able to be able to express the broader notion of that, which is, I guess, what you've been talking about. There's also something interesting that you kind of dropped into the conversation, and I think I have a more historic but similar situation of growing up in a place in London. So I grew up in Clapham Battersea at a time before that was gentrified as well. Though I saw, as I was a teenager and then growing into adulthood, how rapidly it was gentrifying. But there is something about being in a space where you belong, and maybe you create that in your various workshops and so on. But we also have it in where we live and where we grew up sometimes. And some of the stuff that we've done, and my colleague Laia Bikara's just named Checker has done, is to focus on how important an ethnically concentrated community is for protection in relation to things like mental health, things like racism, and so on. I'm not sure if that's things like the barber shop or the mosque or whatever it might be, or the Saturday, you know, the extra schooling and so on, how that enables you to feel safe where you are.
Man, I walk into my barber shop and it's, oh, every black man knows that feeling, like, you know, and every black barbershop's different, but there's this pulsating energy, and it's I smile because it's like, yeah, it's belonging. It's you know, it's again going back to that. It's a hug without being hugged. You know, it's feeling seen without uttering a word. You know, you're in that space. You walk in the door and you're seen, and that again allows. Do you know what it is? It's breathing. It's a breath. It's a breathe. You know what I mean? It's because there's so many times that as black men, as people of color, you hold your breath, right? And I mean that physically and metaphorically, right? Where it's your breath is cut off, or you know, you change, the pace of your breathing changes because there's a police officer across the road, or there's a you know, X, Y, and Z. Your breathing changes, right? You change it, or it's automatically changed for you from the fight or flight mechanisms of the body because of all the shit that we've seen, and that is a threat. And then you walk into a barbershop and you can just breathe. You don't think about your breathing. You're just there. You belong. You're there, and you can, you know. So yeah, they're sacred. They're sacred, and I think about Dalston in Hackney, which anyone who's, you know, watching this, who's been a Hackney person before gentrification would know the kind of changes. Or maybe you maybe don't have to live there to have known the changes, but like I remember walking good points and bad points, right? I remember walking down Dalston High Road, I think it's called, the main high road of Dalston. And when I was younger, just always looking over my shoulder, I was like, fuck, you know, a bit dodgy, you know. But there were more Caribbean shops. There were more, you know, there was just so much more. The energy was something else. And thank God, Ridley Road market, the market is still there, and hope that stays. But you know, you got. Let me tell you something. Yeah, I know we got question and answers coming up. Well, we got Costa. Listen, you got a Costa here on the Dalston Kingsland. Is it Dalston Kingsland? And then literally a minute, if that, you got another Costa there. Like, why do you need two Costas across the flipping road, lads? What are you doing? Anyway, just cafe shops galore. But yeah, I echo the importance of those sacred spaces, James, for sure.
Yeah, and sacred spaces, of course, that also allow us to, although we perform in them as well, but they allow us to express certain elements of our vulnerability because they are safe spaces, and supportive spaces in various ways. And one of the things I've been thinking is about the ways in which we see the public sector investing in alternative forms of care and treatment. Maybe they also need to invest in maintaining those communities and those spaces. But we do need to move to question and answer. This has gone much more quickly than I thought it was going to. I'm going to have a quick look at the question and answer box or the editing of the question and answer box, and see whether there's stuff that we really need to, or we could begin to talk about. No, I'm finding that
there's a lot in it.
Yeah, there appear to be a large number of questions and answers. Okay, I'll just do it in some random order that I just see them. And so this is, apologies if I pronounce people's names wrongly, but this is Tulika Jar, who says, I feel that Lanre's work of movement and embodiment leaves less space for disconnection, in inverted commas. It grabs you, puts you against the wall, and commands your connection. Why are we not using this in mental health, all areas, education, therapeutic intervention, bidding, commissioning, policy making? So I think she's asking you, or us, I guess it's for both of us, she's asking you about the importance of shutting down space for disconnection. So to keep people engaged, keep people involved, commanding their connection, commanding their attention. You do talk about that, I guess, when you're talking about the hug, the touch.
Yeah, I think, you know what? I think it's such an important point raised, and I believe obviously I believe that, and I want that, but I think one thing that I've learned just creatively and professionally is knowing and is the scale of the work, right? Because to get that to happen, it needs to have a certain scale, and certain people need to see it, or it needs to keep. And I think that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And touch wood, I'm working on a few things that hopefully will create that scale and start to hopefully get into those kind of spaces. But I'm always really interested and open, and especially after that experience I did in the prison, of doing this more, for sure.
Yeah, and I think perhaps academics like me need to think about this a little bit more. I did kind of say that I do try and engender emotion in my audience and connection in my audience, but maybe I should think about ways of doing that more explicitly and so on. Though I'm not a performer in a kind of more classical sense, but to think about the way that I can use your research evidence to put people against the wall, as Julika suggests. There's another question which I'm going to kind of reshape, which is about how the stereotypes about Black and danger are still present in mental health systems, and that we're still talking about this, and that we need to start, or we need to start conversations that mention race, and I think racism is intended there. And how can we do that more in our research and in our performance? And maybe while you think about that, Lanre, I'll just say something, because I've had a chance to look at the question. I'll just say something about research. And for me, what's really important in terms of talking about racism in research is to talk about the ways in which racism shapes people's lives. So to not abstract it, not to say, here's the level of racism in our society, these are this evidence of institutional racism and so on, but to actually talk about and I accept that I need to do this more, but to actually talk about the way in which racism shapes people's lives and the consequences it carries. So then you can begin to maybe do that emotion work, that connection work as well when you do
that. Yes. I mean, there is no difference in, my answer is the same. And I'm not just saying that, like because I think that for me, that is what gets people up against the wall, right? Is when you see a human being, how their life has been really affected by these things, rather than just, so yes. Yes. Next question, boy, because I'm so...
Yeah. Now, here's another question from Susella Palmer. Sorry, I forgot to mention the name of the first, the last question, but from Susella Palmer, who asked, would bringing therapists into communities help to foster understanding and bridge barriers between services and young Black males? And I wonder whether into communities is sufficient.
And I don't know, what do we mean into communities, right? And I'm sure obviously it will be, because do we mean into council estates, which is a community? Do we mean the Black, do you know what I mean? I think we need to get specific, and I don't think I think for me, that's just the questions that I want to know, because I think that's I think there's actually definitely some grounding in that for sure. I just think the approach and the specificity is going to be really important in doing that, because I think it's not just therapists. I think people who maybe have, like if it's a council estate, a young Black man who's grown up in that estate and can relate to whoever the people are. Do you know what I mean? There needs to be this relatable, rather than
I suppose what lies behind the question is, in part, I think we had a bit of a conversation about this, in part the distance between the therapist and the client, and how to bridge that distance in some way. And you could imagine that therapists should have the skills and experience to do that, but perhaps not all do. And that connects me to what you were saying about your experience of going into a prison and doing work with a group of young men, and how that perhaps forces those of us who are distant from that to actually confront the humanity of the people who are there, rather than to think of them as alien, other, dangerous, difficult, antisocial, but to actually see their humanity and to connect with them in ways that, let's.
We got to.
Yeah, we've still got a few minutes, so let me pick up a few more questions. And I apologise to people who've given questions in that we're not.
Can I ask one? I've just seen one. I literally just rolled and I've seen this and I haven't even finished it. But the first, Lanre, do you think this anxiety or stress that you describe being held in the body rather than the mind is a specific issue for young Black men who may be used to being regarded with suspicion and potentially as a physical threat by police and others? Yeah. It's kind of what I spoke about before, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot, obviously, but when I walk down the street, and I know this is the same for many Black men, and I just see police officers, who are most of the time white, walking towards me, my physiology changes, right? There's something that changes. There's a heightened alertness. Sometimes maybe my heartbeat beats faster, maybe, but there's something that's heightened in me. All these things in the body start firing, right? Sometimes if there's 1 to 10, sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 5, but it's always something's happening, right? That is something that I and many Black men experience that a lot of people who are not Black don't experience, right? So if you imagine that on repeated as times go on, and then let alone when you are stopped and searched as a Black man, right, as a young Black man, let alone that it's just the walking past or so to answer your question, for sure, I think it is heightened because of those things, for sure.
Yeah, and really importantly, of course, we can in research trace those biological effects and the accumulation of those biological effects and how they disrupt your biological metabolism, but also how they disrupt your DNA and the way your DNA performs. And then, and kind of, as I've said, talking about that in relatively abstract academic circles doesn't bring the emotion and the flavor of that, whereas talking about it in this kind of environment, actually you can begin to feel the emotion that's attached to that. It's horrific to think of these long-term biological changes that then result in a whole host of health problems, including mental health, of course, as a result of what someone else might consider to be relatively low-level innocuous encounters. When you see the danger coming to you, even if it doesn't end up being an event. Emotion is a kind of interesting. I just want to go to another question. This is someone who is an anonymous attendee, but who raises a kind of really interesting point about emotion as well, and says, "I am fascinated by the idea of you both swearing, and Lanre bellowing with laughter as you've just done when James mentioned the difficulty with his professional colleagues discussing race. When I think about how we are not socialized to talk about race and Blackness, and how emotionally Blackness, as Lanre describes, is often held as culture in the body first and foremost. If we consider the visceral life and death expressions of Blackness so often seen, do you think it's possible to authentically discuss race without such expressed emotion like swearing, crying, and shouting? And I guess from your work, the answer would be, of course, you have to have the swearing, the crying, and shouting. Or maybe I'm...
Oh, I'd love to dig into that question more, because that's just not it. It's not, there's also I used, if you remember the start of this conversation, the word nuance, right? And so for me, swearing, crying, and shouting isn't nuance, and that's not inside the stuff that I want to do and that I do. Right now, what you're seeing here is me, right? But in terms of the work and the effects that it has, I do feel like, and I totally appreciate the question, but I do feel like that it isn't just crying, you know, shouting and swearing. Actually, there's a lot of detail and definition and nuance that I work really hard to put in, so that these conversations are not just about crying, swearing, and shouting. So I'm backing up a little bit against that from my perspective of what I believe that I do. But to answer the question, I think it's a conversation that isn't one side. You can't, this is why, if there is an element of that within my work, which at points there are, that's not a bad thing, because different people take in different information differently. And I think when it comes to something as really kind of hard as mental health, different elements and different avenues, different ways of attacking it and talking about it are important. And like, you know, for example, humor, right? In Elephant in the Room, which I know Becky's seen, and there's a lot of humor in it, right? Because we're also talking about life. We are talking about life. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about relationships. And that's where the nuance comes, because it's how do you deal with this mental health, with all these other things that life brings. And all these other things that life brings are not just, it's also all these, it's humor, it's this and this and this. And you put all those things together, and it's about fleshing out humanity, which for me is laughing, crying, shouting, whispering, hugging, being very kind of educated, you know, it's all those things that I try and do. So, wow, that's a long-winded answer, but
no, thanks, Lanre. That's from my perspective, that's just so insightful. It's I think it's a really really important contribution to the question answer discussion thing. Really insightful, helpful. Can I bring us to something that is more about services and how we can think about services in relation to mental health? And the comment comes from Jonathan Prasad, who says, my experience is that IAPT services, so these are kind of clinical therapeutic services, aren't set up to meet the cultural needs of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. How can we get the commissioned services to take seriously the needs of, and he apologizes for using the word BAME, to take seriously the needs of BAME communities? Yeah.
It's slowly changing. It's slowly changing. Just to shoot in there, James, because I've spoken a lot, so I'll quickly say this and let you speak. That I know Mind are doing, you know, I'm actually part of a steering group, which I'm actively actually being a part of more now, that is really addressing this, and it's addressing directly mental health within the Black male communities. And this was something that was only formed, I think it was a year ago, right? Just under a year ago. So it does feel like these things are happening, but I don't know on a bigger scale apart from that. So that's all I'll say on that. What about you, James?
No, it's really interesting that you raise Mind as an example, because I'm not going to talk about Mind, but my experience is also that it's not the mainstream that is making these changes. It's the voluntary community, small enterprise organizations that are making the differences. So, but it's interesting their relationship with the mainstream. So in the Manchester context, for example, there is some concern about this, and I'm involved in some discussions around this. But the solution, or the beginnings of the solution, has been very much about the NHS commissioning services from voluntary sector organisations who are Black-led or ethnic minority-led. And so the question is how far from, the question is how well they can reform, revisit the services that they provide, the voluntary sector, or how far they get drawn into doing the same as mainstream services. But at the moment, at least, the Manchester ambition is to say we need services that are led by Asian Muslim communities. We need services that are led by Black African, Black Caribbean communities, where the therapists are from those organizations. They're trained, but they can bring appropriate approaches to the problem. I think there is an issue about how far that is going to be able to move from mainstream, rather than just duplicate it in a different guise. But I think the optimistic approach is that they will, and if they continue to be commissioned, get secure funding, and Mind will be an example of that, then maybe things can change. There's someone here who says thanks for swearing. Oh,
whoever said thanks for swearing, all good.
Yeah. Yeah. Becky, have we run out of time for
We've
questions?
run out of time. I know there are lots of questions, and I'm sure that's a sign of how involved and engaged people have been with the conversation. So I want to give deep thanks to both of you for your time and your contributions, and also for both giving so much of yourselves, which I think people have also really felt, actually. I think I've got to tell everybody to please sign up to our mailing list and social media channels, but also James, to ask you whether you'd just like to let people know about Evens and a little bit more about the code survey.
Yeah.
But thank you both.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a fantastic opportunity, and to be hosted by the Stuart Hall Foundation, of course, is a great honour.
Yeah, thank you.
And a great. I enjoyed the conversation, and sorry that we couldn't deal with all of the issues that people raised or talked to them. So I've been given the floor because I want to talk about, very briefly, about the Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity code, which is a long-standing research centre, the core at University of Manchester, but involving a large number of other universities, where our research agenda is around ethnicity, and particularly around ethnic inequalities, mapping those, and then trying to provide information, policy interventions to address those. And at the moment, we're doing a big research program, which is around COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minority communities and the inequalities that it's engendered. And it covers a whole range of things that go from cultural practice to policing, to education, to housing, and so on. But the thing I really want to highlight is a big survey we're doing at the moment, which is called Evens. And you'll see a slide which has a link to it afterwards. And that also is collecting data on a whole range of things, policing, mental health, for sure. There was a question, where can we get data on mental health during COVID-19 in relation to ethnicity? Not many places, but Evens will be one of them. And my invitation to you is to take part in the survey. Your voice really matters. Get your friends, get your family, and so on to take part in the survey. Your voice really matters, because we are going to use these data in partnership with a range of organisations to advocate and campaign for change. So that was a long spiel, sorry.
Thanks, James.
I'm going to just say one last thing. Am I allowed to? Oh, we're finished.
Say it.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, no, it was just to let people know that at the foundation, one of our institutional partnerships is with the Tavistock Clinic, and that we have had a number of students who've received bursaries and mentoring to address the underrepresentation in the child psychotherapy training, which is an NHS training from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. And we're about to have 4 more, I think, possible students come through that scheme who will be on NHS bursaries. So this is really about addressing issues of underrepresentation, but also I hope having very integrated services for everybody, actually, which is what I'm in favour of.
Amazing. Becky, before we go, yeah, I just want to say, Becky, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor. James, it's a pleasure to speak to you and with you, and thank you for all the work that you do as well. And I know you said something, you said that I'm not a performer. Yes, you are. In your own way. Thank you. I really need to pee. Are we finished now?
I'll wear that badge, Lanre. I'll wear that badge.
Wear the badge, man.
Yeah.
Wear it, James. All right, man.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Peace.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed this.